As the year draws towards ever closer, as we move ever closer towards the next general election, questions of governance, human rights become even more apparent. Just moving out of a recent by-election that unleashed so much violence and protestations from those who participated, questioning its fairness and freeness, where does the country and how does it move towards the 2026 general elections? My guest on NBS Face Off this evening is a governance expert working with ActionAid International. Welcome to NBS Face Off.
Thank
Mary
you.
Grace Munduru.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here.
My name is Charles Mwangushampagi, and this is NBS Face Off. So, Madam Munduru, we just emerging out of a by-election.
Yes.
I want to, in Kawempe North, I want to hear from you. How would you describe it now that it's done and closed?
I think this by-election does not just speak for this process as short as it was. It speaks for something that has evolved over time. And I hate to look at the by-election as a single issue. I think we have had a precedence of similar by-elections, but we see that with every by-election, the cards play differently. I choose to look back at very defining moments in our by-elections, starting with what happened in Arua a couple of years ago that I personally witnessed, looking at what happened in Kayunga, and then the most recent one that we saw in Kawempe North. If you look at the escalation of events, right from the Arua incident, where so many people were abducted, tortured, killed. If you look at Kayunga, similar cards being played by the same players centered around, what happens in these by-elections. And then you come to Kawempe, it shows a pattern. And I don't want to isolate what happened in Kawempe. I want us to look at the pattern of events. And probably these elections also paint a picture of what to expect in the coming elections.
So you give very good, interesting examples of Kawempe North, Kayunga,
and
Arua.
Yes.
The key players are the same.
Yes.
The game is the same.
Yes.
Does that apply? All these are by-elections.
Yes.
Do you expect any changes when you go to a general election?
I do not expect it.
Because the argument, Ms. Munduru, is that when you go into a by-election, there is a concentration
Yes.
of resources,
Yes.
personnel, and attention from the nation.
Yes.
Because it's happening outside of the normal.
Yes.
Yes.
But also,
what does your pattern read?
From my pattern, I think that the more contested a particular constituency is, and the more fierce the elections play out. So if you look at Arua, for example, we were moving from a candidate who represented the NRM to now a contested seat that had a couple of different opposition, contestants and also independent contestants. But the factors leading to that by-election included death. Honorable Abriga was shot and killed. And so between his death and the by-elections, there was a lot of attention to the region, to the specific constituency that he represented. And so that already set a tempo for what the by-elections would look like. And no wonder...
We remember the violence at his barrio.
Exactly.
Yes, the breaking of the chairs.
The breaking of the chairs, yes. The people's, outright expression of, detest in the party that he represented because they believed they didn't do enough to protect him, and there was no accountability for his death, which is the case up to now. So that already set the tempo for how contested that by-election was going to be. So the events that followed that by-election could be foretold. And there were players at the center of what became of those elections. The only difference is, in the case of Arua, at some point the citizens overpowered the security forces, so they could not predominantly play their role as they have done in consequent elections. So if you look at Kawempe North, it's a similar story, except the cards have turned. You had a very popular opposition figure representing a popular opposition party holding elective office dies. His death has a lot of controversy, brings forth a lot of debate on the events leading up to his death.
And then the subsequent.
And then going into such an election meant also a very high contestation between the party he represented, the ruling party, and other players that wanted to test the waters as well. So that means that going into such an election, there are flared emotions. The state has to maintain its presence and go into such a space, proving its relevance and legitimacy, and also showing its ability to, determine the outcomes of any election. It doesn't matter what citizens think. And usually it's characterized by a lot of force, a lot of terror, and all of these events that we saw play. Except in this case, it was taken a notch higher, probably because also the governance, infrastructure, and environment at the moment is not the most desirable for a by-election to happen. And the geographical positioning of this specific area in a place that has traditionally been an opposition stronghold, that means that you don't go into such an election leisurely. You have to have your guards up. You have to make sure that, your rootedness
being
and
a very
presence
urban constituency,
with
a majority impoverished population for voters, for lack of a better word, in Kawempe North, because you have a lot of people who are coming out of the ghetto participating in this election, prone to violence, likely to cause violence. Would you take the justification by the state to deploy the way it did? Because the president, whose commander-in-chief did write and say, the army is trained and prepared for deployment outside of areas like this. And he asked the question, what were they doing there? And he said, they were there because of the violence that the opposition has tended to show.
It's interesting because, I'm yet to see a documented case where deployment follows actual violence. For you to document that
the argument would be
that violence actually happened, and it was at such a magnitude that it warranted a certain level of deployment. Deployment in itself would not be a problem if it's for purposes of, providing security for citizens and anybody participating in an election. But the actions preceding the deployment is what really describes the intention of such a deployment. And like I said, in the lead up to these elections, there were very careless statements from either side that were being peddled on social media. A lot of what happened was foretold about how violence will be deployed, about, the commitment, of the state to ensure that, some of the assumptions that they had about the citizens themselves and other participants in the elections were going to have were at the center stage of narrative. So at the end of the day, the deployment was there, yes, but the actions that followed the deployment, I think, is what really contradicts the intention that is being profiled by security agencies for deploying the way they did.
Let's tackle a critical question regarding elections generally. The allegations of vote rigging. Just a day before the elections in Kawempe, we saw the leader of opposition, the Secretary General of the National Unity Platform, storming a private residence, claiming that ballots were being ticked in that particular place, number plates were being plucked off of vehicles, and then the election happens. You see the Minister of State for Gender parading somebody, apparently with pre-ticked ballot papers.
Ballot papers, yes.
So, NUP set a narrative. Our main opposition, which is the NRM, the ruling party, is hell-bent on rigging this election.
Yes.
The election ends, and NRM is saying, NUP rigged this election.
Yes.
We have evidence, we have arrested somebody with pre-ticked ballot papers. You've seen a protestation from the party officially about that election. A protestation from the president, who's also chairman of the party. A protestation from the Forum for Democratic Change, the other major player in that election. A protestation from the Democratic Party. What does this say? Do we have an opportunity for clean, free, fair elections in this country?
No, I don't think we do. I also say so because, like I said, I don't want to isolate what happened in these elections. In Arua, for example, when we had the by-elections, at that time, in the morning of election day, citizens attacked the RDC then and beat him up and his security operatives, and discovered ballot papers that were being, held in a specific location outside the officially gazetted ones, to be pre-ticked, and they got the information from a whistleblower. And so that violence happened in the morning before people headed out to vote. And at this point, remember, the opposition candidate had been arrested, and they were not even in the district, and a lot had already happened. Somebody had been killed. Nevertheless, he passed. But it did not make the process free and fair either, because the amount of effort that citizens made to guard the votes, to collect evidence of any suspected rigging and all of that, was extremely high. And I think the way that was met in terms of how the security played its games, including, the killing of Bobi Wine's driver the day before, and things that happened in other citizens who were just caught up in the fracas and arrested and disappeared, and all of that, already presented an environment.
I want to pick this up
Yes.
after a very short commercial break. We'll be right back.